October had settled over the high plains country like a damp, heavy quilt soaked in coal dust and the promise of early snow. Thomas, the chief embalmer at Iris and Son's funeral home, felt the chill deep in his bones, a lingering cold that the furnace in the basement preparation room perpetually failed to conquer. He moved with the slow, methodical grace of a man whose work demanded precision and respect for stillness. His world was the antiseptic hush of the mortuary, a realm defined by stainless steel, clean lines, and the pervasive, slightly sweet scent of formaldehyde that clung to his scrubs and seemed over the decades to have permeated the very lining of his lungs. Tonight, Thomas finished a routine case, wiping down the arterial injection pump with a piece of gauze. Savoring the late-night quiet, routine was his comfort, the anatomical certainty of the human body his bedrock. But routine, like all things solid, was about to meet the irresistible force of the profoundly unnatural. The phone, a cheap plastic wall unit in the corner of the preparation room, shrieked just after 11:30 p.m. It was a sound that did not belong in this place. No one called a funeral home this late unless disaster had already struck. Thomas hesitated, pulling off his neutral gloves. The pop of the latex against the silence was loud enough to make him jump. The voice on the other end was clipped, utterly devoid of inflection, a dry sound like gravel shifting. Mr. Thomas, we require immediate services, a private job. Cremation. Thomas frowned, adjusting the collar of his shirt. Iris and Sons handles cremations, yes, but services are usually scheduled for the morning. We require positive identification and triple rate. The voice cut in, smooth and sharp as a scalpel. Cash payment, immediate transfer. No paperwork beyond minimum state requirement, no questions. The offer was obscene. Triple the standard fee paid under the table for a rush job. It was enough money to replace the worn-out heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system in the viewing parlor. Thomas's rational mind, exhausted by a long week, recognized the sudden, ugly allure of the cash. Who is the deceased? Large male. Unknown origin. Internal bleeding and shock. Immediate attention, please. We are 5 minutes out. Thomas agreed, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. The anonymity, the hurry, the aggressive lack of negotiation. It was all wrong. Funeral service centered on dignity and process. This smelled of desperation and concealment. He unlocked the rear entrance, waiting beneath the buzzing yellow lamp that cast a weak, sickly glow on the alley's frozen asphalt. The transport arrived not in a standard hearse, but a long, black, heavy-duty cargo vehicle. It resembled something the federal government used for hazardous waste disposal rather than final transport. The back door hissed open, revealing not a polished mahogany casket, but a massive steel container. It was a brutish, utilitarian box, welded from thick sheets of dark metal, scarred with rust and handling marks. Heavy nautical-grade chains, thick as Thomas's wrist, were wrapped haphazardly around it, secured by oversized pitted padlocks. The chain seemed designed to keep whatever was inside from simply walking out. 2 men in dark, stained overalls supervised the unloading. They were silent, their faces grimed with exhaustion and a fine brown dirt. They did not meet Thomas's eyes. Using a hydraulic dolly, they wrestled the container onto the service lift. The container's immense weight groaned against the mechanism. Basement, Thomas directed, pointing to the lift button. The taller of the 2 men wiped his hands nervously on his coveralls, leaving dark smudges. We are just the movers, sir. We do not go down there. Too heavy, too greasy. We get it off the truck. We get paid. That is the end of our involvement." The other man shivered, though the temperature inside the bay was barely 40 degrees Fahrenheit. "It smells like a wet, frozen animal that has been dragged through the mud for miles. Just sign the manifest, please." The manifest was sparse, barely a scrap of legal documentation. Cause of ending: internal hemorrhage and shock name, not applicable. Weight: a staggering 370 pounds. The client was listed only as third-party administrator. The most chilling instruction was highlighted in thick black marker. Container must remain completely sealed until preparations begin. Thomas scrawled his name, feeling the cold seep into his writing hand. The two movers bolted, leaving the steel sarcophagus on the lift. He lowered the container into the basement preparation room himself. The noise of the machinery was muffled by the concrete walls. Alone now, the silence returned, heavier than before. He walked up to the container. It was freezing to the touch, radiating a profound cold that transcended mere temperature. He laid his palm against the thick metal side. He felt an undeniable, subtle internal vibration. This was not residual movement from the transport or the lift. It was tension, a profound pressure held in check. He knew instinctively that this contained not a deceased person, but something aggressively locked away. Thomas walked to the wall panel and flipped the switch for the heavy-duty ventilation system, sucking the stale, heavy air out of the room. He arranged his instruments on the stainless steel table, the needles, scalpels, and embalming machine. Their quiet glint a testament to the order he imposed on the chaotic process of decomposition. He was a rational man. He was a professional. He was well paid for this night's intrusion. He tried to force the unease into the background, pushing it behind the familiar mechanical steps of his trade. But the anxiety persisted, a cold, sharp shard of certainty that his meticulously clean, measured world was about to collide violently with something that refused classification, something that lived outside the boundaries of anatomy and reason he knew, with a certainty that made his skin prickle, that the weight of the metal was not meant to keep the outside world away from the body. It was meant to keep the body away from the world. He reached for the heavy-duty bolt cutters, ready to break the chains. He told himself it was just a big man, a very, very heavy man. But the smell, that musky, wet dirt stench, had already begun to bleed through the seal. He took a deep, steadying breath and began his work. The chains were a brute deterrent, overkill against the quiet indignity of the already eliminated Thomas, worked slowly with the bolt cutters. The snap of the tempered steel links echoed in the concrete enclosure. He kept his back to the freight door, hyper-aware that he was performing this ritual alone, sealed 30 feet below grade. The cold of the steel was abrasive on his hands, even through the thin cotton gloves he wore beneath his heavier nitrile pair. Once the chains were off, he struggled with the latches. They were stiff, secured with a sealant that had cracked with age. A final heave, and the heavy lid groaned open, scraping metal on metal, a hideous sound like a giant fingernail dragged across a blackboard. The smell intensified instantly, overwhelming the formaldehyde, assaulting his mucous membranes. It was metallic, old, thick blood, but it was layered with the sharp, acidic tang of pine needles and a pervasive, hot, sharp animal musk, the scent of fear and adrenaline layered over decay. It was the odor of something wild and desperate. Caught out in the extreme cold beneath a thick plastic liner lay the body. Thomas had prepared thousands of people in his career. Victims of accidents, victims of illness, victims of themselves. He knew human anatomy intimately. What lay before him defied immediate, easy classification. It was immense. The 370-pound estimate felt conservative. The musculature was exaggerated, dense, coiled. It was folded into the crate, limbs bent at angles that attested to powerful, unnatural flexibility. The body had not been laid out for transport. It had been jammed in place. Thomas adjusted the overhead lamp. The skin was a sickly gray-green pallor in the harsh light, stretched tight over a massive, strangely shaped frame. The rib cage was crushed and distorted, clearly subjected to immense blunt force. Yet it was extraordinarily wide, providing an impossible anchor point for the heavy shoulder structure. The limbs were long, ending in disproportionately large hands and feet, covered in sparse, stiff, dark hair that manifested less as body hair and more as fine, wiry quills protruding through the epidermis. He moved around the table, forcing himself into professional mode, cataloging the injuries. This was not a myth. It was biology pushed to a grotesque, agonizing extreme. The joints were built to allow for quadrupedal movement. The knees and elbows were heavily calloused. The skin was riddled with penetrating wounds. Multiple sites showed where heavy caliber rounds had struck and penetrated the thick, fibrous muscles, particularly across the upper chest and flank. But several entry points appeared shallow, revealing that the high-powered munitions had failed to achieve deep penetration against the unnatural density of the bone, and sinew beneath the bones were not merely broken. In places they had splintered internally, shattering and then reforming imperfectly, indicating a monstrous, rapid healing capacity that had finally been overcome by sustained, brutal attack. On the neck, partially obscured by the coarse hair, was a savage, tearing wound, a deep semicircular laceration that was the result of an encounter with another large predator, or perhaps a struggle with its own kind. Death had been violent, protracted, and brutally finalized. He took the necessary photographs. The flash reflected off the cold steel. He prepared his equipment for arterial injection. This procedure would be difficult. The sheer density of the muscles made locating the main vascular highways a challenge. He made the necessary incision on the wrist. Searching for the radial artery, he cut deeper than usual. The tissue offered unexpected rubbery resistance. The muscle bundles were braided together, hard as old leather. When he finally found the artery, it was a thick, corded vessel, unlike anything he had ever dealt with. As he threaded the catheter, the muscles around the vessel twitched. A deep, unsettling tremor ran down the length of the forearm. Thomas pulled his hands back sharply. He stared at the limb. Residual nerve conduction, he reasoned, trying to keep the horror at bay sometimes. Muscle memory or residual electrical charge caused post-mortem reflexes. But this was too pronounced, too forceful. He secured the catheter and started the injection pump, introducing the first potent slug of embalming solution, the fluid designed to halt decay and replace blood. The reaction was immediate and terrifying. The chest muscles of the creature swelled noticeably, not from expansion, but contraction. The long, bony fingers, splayed on the steel table, curled inward slightly, like a hawk's talons preparing to grip prey. Thomas's own breath hitched, cold air burning his throat. He cut the pump instantly. The silence rushed back in to fill the vacuum. He was drenched in a cold sweat that smelled sharp against the formaldehyde. He stared at the face, or what passed for a face. It was long, narrow, with a heavy, pronounced brow ridge. The mouth was thick-lipped, resting slightly ajar. He leaned closer, checking the seal on the catheter. That was when he heard it. It was not a sigh. It was not air escaping the lungs due to external pressure. It was a low, wet, sucking sound, a mechanical intake, as stagnant air was slowly, deliberately drawn through partially closed vocal cords. It was the sound a massive predator makes when tasting the air. Thomas recoiled, staggering back against the sterile steel counter behind him. The counter clanged with the impact. His heart hammered a brutal rhythm against his ribs. He stared across the room at the creature's head. One eye, partially covered by a thick gray lid, was turned toward him. It was a pale, dense orb, lacking the familiar definition of a human iris. And in that terrifying, interminable second, Thomas saw the eye, veiled by its death glaze, rotate. Just a fraction of an inch. But it was enough. It was looking at him. It was classifying him. The thing on the table was dead, yes, but it was not finished. It was suspended in a state that science could not explain, waiting for the embalmer to approach its vulnerable spots once more. Thomas gripped the counter edge so hard his knuckles turned white. The professional detachment shattered by the certainty that he was sharing the room with something that was chemically and physically refusing to yield to the piece of the end. The terrifying paralysis lasted only a few seconds. But in that small, concrete room, time stretched into an eternity of cold, metallic fear. Thomas felt the desperate internal struggle between logic and the primal terror screaming in his ears. Reflection, gas buildup, post-mortem shifting. He recited the clinical explanations like a failing mantra. But the rotation of that heavy, pale eye had been deliberate. A slow, agonizing assessment. He forced himself to move, walking in a wide, shaky circle around the table. The creature remained still, its immense body radiating a cold that seemed to absorb the light. It looked less dead and more profoundly, brutally dormant. He had a job to do, and the cash payment already transferred to his account was far too heavy a stake to abandon. He had to finish the procedure, seal the body, and begin the cremation process immediately, as stipulated. He advanced cautiously, his hand hovering near the injection pump controls. He had paused the flow of formalin, the standard arterial preservative, a potent mixture of formaldehyde and methanol, was meant to arrest cellular function. Instead, it had triggered a response. Thomas restarted the pump, deciding to try a lower pressure, a gentler introduction of the fluid. As the sweet, acidic fluid began to replace the creature's dense, viscous blood, the muscle reaction returned, far stronger this time. He was focused on the input valve when the surge hit. The muscles in the creature's forearm, which had previously twitched, now constricted violently like a massive hydraulic clamp slamming shut. The rigid artery, trying to expel the unwanted chemical intruder, slammed the catheter needle out of the vein. It shot out with a horrific, sucking schluck sound, splattering a shower of dark, thick, uncongealed blood across the stainless steel table and Thomas's exposed forearm. "No," Thomas whispered. The sound was thin and strangled in the echoing room. This was beyond any physiological response he had ever encountered. The body was actively, violently rejecting the embalming agent. It was a metabolic function, a living process of resistance, occurring hours, perhaps a day, after the official end. He grabbed a towel, trying to stem the new flow of thick, metallic-smelling blood leaking onto the table. He approached the wrist again, his mind racing. If he could not conserve the body, he could not legally process the cremation. He had to use internal injections, penetrating the dense tissues directly, a brute force approach. As he leaned over, his gaze traced the line of the creature's neck. In the sickly light, he noticed a subtle change in the pelt. The sparse, wiry hairs along the spine and shoulders were lifting, erecting themselves like the hackles of a massive, disturbed canine. He stepped back again, heart hammering. He was seeing the biological equivalent of static electricity, a response to a perceived threat. Me. He turned toward the instrument cabinet to retrieve a deeper, penetrating needle. When he pivoted back, the view across the creature's face had shifted. The thick gray lips, previously slack and slightly parted, were now subtly drawn back. The rigid contraction of the facial muscles revealed the tip of a massive, off-white canine tooth nestled against the gum line. This was an undeniable grimace, an incomplete show of violence, halted by the creature's current state of forced stasis. But undeniably there, the triple payment suddenly felt like blood money. Thomas was seized by an overwhelming need to terminate the procedure immediately, seal the crate, and contact the client or the authorities. Triple payment be damned. This thing was a biological anomaly, a hazard, and keeping it contained was more important than professional reputation or financial gain. He reached for the heavy-duty lever that controlled the ventilation system, flipping it off to muffle any sound he might make, then pulled his cellular phone from his pocket. He was deep underground, surrounded by thick, reinforced concrete that deadened sound and signal. No service. He started for the concrete steps that led up to the ground floor office where the landline was located. He had to report this, classify it as unprocessable or maybe even as a biological containment issue. He took 3 steps. The sound started behind him, low and wet, growing in intensity. It was not a growl or a snarl. It was a drawn-out, viscous scrape, like something profoundly heavy slowly uncoiling, something that had been bent against its will, and was now being pulled straight by immense deep-seated power. Thomas stopped, frozen midway up the steps. He dared not turn completely, but twisted his head back toward the preparation table. The shadows were deep, but he clearly saw the creature's silhouette. The flesh on its massive chest had visibly tautened, pulling tight across the immense structure of its ribs and the broken, jagged ribs. Those that had suffered blunt force trauma shifted with a slow, grinding crunch sound. They were actively repositioning themselves, correcting their deformation, preparing the body for full, unhampered movement. The thing was not merely resisting the embalming. It was repairing itself. It was waking up. Thomas knew with cold certainty that he had only minutes before the creature moved from defensive spasms to full, conscious locomotion. The cold stillness of the mortuary had become a pressure cooker, and he was trapped inside with a thing that defied the natural laws of life and death he had to run. Now, the thin veneer of rationality snapped. Thomas scrambled the remaining steps, his shoes slipping on the damp concrete. He burst through the fire door leading from the preparation room into the narrow administrative corridor, driven by a pure, blinding panic he had not experienced since he was a child. He was no longer Thomas, the meticulous embalmer. He was prey. He reached the front office, a space built for hushed consultations and soft lighting. He grabbed the heavy black receiver of the landline, his fingers shaking so violently he dropped it once before snatching it up again. He fumbled with the dial, aiming for the town's emergency services number. Below him, in the preparation room, the first sound of true violence erupted: crack thump. It was a sound that shook the building's foundation, a dull, subterranean percussion of massive force meeting thick concrete. The creature was not walking. It was testing its limits against its environment. Thomas froze, the receiver vibrating against his ear, waiting for the dial tone that would not come fast enough. Thud crunch. The sound was closer to the stairwell now, followed by a sickening sound of rending metal. The specialized door to the refrigeration unit, which contained a secondary high-value shipment of tissue samples, utilized a motion-sensitive internal alarm. That alarm chose that moment to erupt, a high-pitched, insistent, utterly maddening electronic shriek that cut through the concrete floor and screamed into the night air. Thomas dropped the phone again. He ran back to the doorway leading to the basement stairs, not out of bravery, but out of a paralyzing need to know the location of the threat. The container box, the massive steel crate designed to hold an unimaginable weight, was ripped open. The heavy-duty lid no longer rested against the floor. It was violently bent upward like a flower petal, its thick metal surface crumpled as though it were mere aluminum foil. The creature stood. It had not sprung to life with cinematic speed. Its emergence was a slow, agonizing heave, an expulsion. It pushed itself out of the ruined container, leaning heavily on the steel slab of the preparation table with its long, bony, five-fingered hands. It was unsteady, coated in its own clotted, dark blood and smeared with the toxic, milky traces of the rejected formalin. Thomas saw the movement that was not circulatory, the source of the creature's undeath. Along the massive, ropey muscles of its spine and sternum, he saw a violent, persistent pulsation. It was not the rhythmic beat of a heart pumping oxygenated blood. That system was largely destroyed, the hemorrhage fatal. This was a sustained, agonizing contraction of muscle fiber, generating residual power and directed by deep, ancient instinct. The body was running on pure anaerobic post-mortem energy, a biological battery that had refused to fully discharge. The thing was turning its head. Its movements were slow, burdened by the internal damage and the sheer bulk of its frame. The eyes were still hooded, but they were no longer looking at the table. They were scanning the geometry of the room, slowly charting the walls and the ceiling. There was no discernible rage in its posture, no overt aggression aimed at him, only a painful, suffering need for direction. It was wounded, trapped, and it needed to escape the white light and the toxic air of the embalming room it needed the night. Thomas could feel the sickening blend of formalin, antiseptic cleaner, and the musky, iron-rich scent of the creature's blood filling his airways. He slammed the heavy-duty steel door to the preparation room, a specialized airtight unit designed for cold retention, and threw the thick metal bolt home. It was not reinforced enough to stop a thing of that size if it chose to charge, but it bought him a precious few seconds. He did not run to the front door of the funeral home. He knew he could not risk the chance of it gaining access to the street, to the quiet, sleeping town. He ran into the adjacent utility corridor, a narrow, dark space behind the cold storage units, designed only for maintenance staff. He sank against the wall, clutching his bleeding forearm where the spray of blood had hit him, and listened to the horror unfold just beyond the steel door. He was no longer just the embalmer. He was the accidental, terrified custodian of a biological catastrophe. The service corridor was tight, barely 3 feet wide, lined with shelves holding bleach, floor wax, and industrial-sized cans of coffee. The air here was heavy with the smell of ammonia and aged dust, a sickly sweet blend that offered little comfort. Thomas pressed himself against the back wall, trying to disappear into the shadows. The cold of the concrete was a damp certainty against his back. He heard the creature clearly now, its location confined by the sealed preparation room. The alarm from the refrigeration unit still screamed, a banshee wail that agitated the beast further. The steps were heavy, irregular, punctuated by a dragging, scraping sound. It was not the sound of a human moving. It was the weighty, awkward shuffle of an animal unfamiliar with upright posture, or perhaps simply too wounded to manage it gracefully. Thomas listened intently. The sound of the creature's movements was not focused on the heavy door he had just bolted. It was moving across the room toward the far corner. Near the huge industrial slop sink, it was not hunting him. It was orienting itself. Through the thin gap beneath the steel door, Thomas saw the dark, viscous traces of its blood smearing across the pale tile floor. It was leaking steadily, each drop blackening instantly against the antiseptic whiteness. The creature behaved exactly like a grievously wounded animal that had been flushed from its den, seeking the fastest, quietest path back to cover. It did not want a confrontation. It wanted to disappear into the noise in the dark. The city, even this small, quiet city, was not its habitat. Thomas felt a chilling, profound understanding bloom amidst the terror. If this thing broke loose, it would not stalk people for sport. It would simply destroy anything that stood between it and the deep, silent wilderness it craved. The thought of that dense, unnatural body breaking through a home window, crashing through the quiet streets, brought the terror into sharp, practical focus. This was not about the triple raid anymore. This was about absolute containment. He, Thomas, the mortician, was the only thing standing between this escaped specimen and the unwitting sleeping populace. A strange, cold sense of duty, forged in the terror of the previous hour, settled over him. He carefully pulled his cellular phone from his pocket again, sliding it out inch by agonizing inch. Terrified of the synthetic material rubbing against his rough scrubs, he held it close to his chest, muffling any noise, and began to dial the town's emergency services number. If he could only whisper the address, if he could alert the authorities to the fact that a large, dangerous creature was contained in the basement, they could bring in heavy-duty containment teams. The moment the screen flickered, casting a microscopic blue glow against his shirt, the movement in the preparation room changed. The creature stopped dragging its feet. The alarm still screamed, but the beast reacted to a sound Thomas could not even perceive. The minute electrical hum of the cellular phone, or the change in Thomas's own breathing. A sharp, metallic RRIP of sound. The industrial-grade stainless steel sink, anchored to the wall, tore free from its moorings and crashed to the floor. The sound was followed by a wet, guttural huff from the creature, confirming it had found the source of the subtle noise disturbance. The creature had located him. The heavy footsteps, now purposeful, began to approach the narrow, bolted steel door. Thomas knew the door was structurally weaker than the freight entrance, and the bolt would hold for only a few seconds against 370 pounds of agonizing post-mortem power. He had to shift its focus. He could not let it reach the door. If it broke through, he would be cornered in the utility corridor, and the creature would have access to the main floor, scanning the corridor. He saw the master control panel for the building's utility systems. Above it, running along the ceiling, was the massive return air vent for the preparation room, a straight, wide duct leading directly outside to the exhaust fan unit, mounted on the back wall of the building, 20 feet above the ground. If the creature was desperate to escape, and if Thomas could make that path seem more appealing than the bolted door, he could redirect it. The beast operated on basic survival logic. Find the way out, any way out. Thomas reached up slowly, his fingers brushing the dust-caked industrial switch for the central ventilation system. It was time to introduce maximum chaos. He prayed the screaming alarm had not totally deafened it to other, more pressing sounds. He needed to make the exit the only thing it focused on. Thomas flipped the switch for the ventilation system. The sudden increase in power hit instantly. The ductwork, old and slightly loose, began to vibrate with a deafening bass-heavy roar. The air in the preparation room, already agitated by the chemical vapors and the creature's heavy breathing, churned in a powerful vortex. The sound was not sharp or high-pitched, but a profound, resonant bzzzzzzz that shook the light fixtures. It was designed to move several thousand cubic feet of air per minute, and now, at maximum power, it felt like standing in an airplane engine testing facility. The creature's approach to the bolted door stopped abruptly. Thomas heard a choked, grating noise of confusion and pain. The beast, already compromised and running on heightened instincts, could not tolerate the sudden, overwhelming auditory intrusion. It recoiled. Thomas saw the shadow beneath the door shift rapidly, moving away from the corridor entrance and toward the back wall of the preparation room, where the massive ventilation intake was situated. This was his chance. He quietly moved from his hiding place and raced down the corridor, passing the concrete stairs he had just fled. His breath came in shallow, painful gasps. He headed toward the storage area for toxic waste, chemicals too potent for general cleaning. He grabbed the nearest sealed container, a 2-gallon plastic jug of highly concentrated industrial-strength glutaraldehyde solution. It was a vicious, acrid preservative, far more potent than the standard formalin. Designed to preserve tissue samples under extreme conditions, it was toxic enough to cause severe burns and respiratory collapse in high concentration. He bolted back to the preparation room door. The moment he reached it, he heard the creature attempting to tear at the metal housing of the air intake. He did not open the door. He was a professional. He knew the structural weak points of the building. On the bottom of the steel door was a small slotted plate, a few inches wide, designed to allow fresh air intake when the preparation room was operating under negative pressure. Thomas twisted the lid off the glutaraldehyde jug. The fumes were instantly overwhelming, burning his eyes and throat despite the filter mask he wore loosely around his neck. He tipped the 2 gallons of liquid through the narrow slot. The concentrated solution hit the floor, instantly spreading. The fluid began to vaporize slightly in the warm air, creating a dense, low-lying cloud of chemical smoke. The creature inhaled the cloud. The reaction was immediate and savage. The beast let out a noise that was half scream, half cough. A sound of profound internal agony. It stumbled backward, thrashing wildly. The chemical had assaulted its delicate, hypersensitive nasal passages and lungs. It wheeled around, desperate to escape the toxic air. It saw the wide, dark opening of the main exhaust duct, the source of the immense vibration, and the path to the outside. To the beast, disoriented and choking, the duct became the definition of freedom. Thomas heard the creature launching itself at the opening. The massive frame, driven by pure instinct, began to force itself into the rectangular gap. The metal grill snapped and ripped away from the concrete wall. The beast squeezed through. Its massive shoulders and wide chest pushed past the jagged metal edges. But the duct was only designed for air, not 370 pounds of densely packed muscle and bone. It made it through its head and chest. Then it stopped, wedged tightly at the pelvis. Unable to move forward or retreat, Thomas saw his opportunity. A narrow window to end the threat without unleashing it upon the town. He ran to the large, cumbersome maintenance access panel directly beneath the duct. It controlled the heavy internal steel damper that regulated airflow to the outside. It was a massive, rusted steel plate, thick as a telephone book. He grabbed the large T-shaped lever. Fear was a bitter, metallic taste in his mouth, but the sense of immediate, absolute duty overrode it. If he could slam the damper shut and lock it, the beast would be permanently trapped, its vital temporary pathway to escape sealed. Thomas threw his entire weight against the lever, his muscles screaming in protest as he fought against the rusted mechanism. The heavy steel damper plate, designed to open and close only a few times a year for maintenance, began to grind slowly into position, inching toward the closing gap. The creature, trapped and desperate, understood the threat instantly. The agony of the glutaraldehyde fumes, the pain of its bullet wounds, and the overwhelming noise were suddenly secondary to the profound danger of being sealed into this concrete tomb. It stopped trying to push outward. It focused its entire monstrous energy on pulling backward, trying to free its hips from the tight, painful crush of the ductwork. Its movements were now focused and manic. Claws, thick and dark, scraped against the internal steel walls of the ventilation shaft, producing a high-pitched metallic shriek and a cascade of sparks that lit the immediate area in sickly flashes. Thomas gritted his teeth, his arms burning. The damper was halfway closed. He needed 3 more feet of travel to seal it entirely. A long, lean arm, covered in dark, matted hair, shot out of the narrowing gap in the ductwork. The hand, ending in thick, bony claws, whipped across the space and seized Thomas's forearm. The pain was immediate, electrifying, and absolute. The claws were not like an animal's talons. They were curved, bone-hard extensions of the fingers. They tore through the sleeve of Thomas's scrub shirt like wet paper, sinking deep into the flesh of his shoulder and forearm. A searing, ripping heat flooded his nervous system. He roared, a sound torn from deep in his chest, a sound he barely recognized. His blood immediately flowed, hot and copious, streaming down his wrist and splashing onto the concrete floor, mingling with the formalin and the creature's thick, dark ichor. He felt the immense power of the grip, not trying to pull him into the shaft, but simply holding him fast, locking him in place so he could not finish closing the door. In his other hand, Thomas was still clutching the heavy, broad metal spackle used for smoothing the prepared skin of the deceased. It was a weight he was used to handling, a tool of his trade. Now it became a weapon. Driven by sheer, raw survival instinct and the necessity of his dreadful duty, he swung the tool in a wide arc, aiming for the creature's exposed wrist, the point where its unnaturally dense bone was constrained by the narrow duct opening clang. Metal against bone. The sound was sharp, sickening. The grip on his arm tightened spasmodically, sending a new wave of excruciating pain up his shoulder. He swung again, drawing on a reservoir of energy he did not know he possessed. The second blow was fueled by pure terror and the red certainty of his own immediate end if he failed crack. A different sound this time, a wet, terrible yielding. Thomas swung a third time, aiming with frantic, tear-blinded precision at the point where the bone had cracked. The third impact produced an awful, pulpy, grinding sound. The thick joint of the creature's wrist gave way. The grip on Thomas's arm released instantly. The shredded flesh of his forearm burned with the sudden absence of pressure. The creature let out its first true roar, a massive, low-frequency sound of unbearable physical pain, a tearing, guttural howl that compressed the very air in the basement. The injured limb was violently retracted back into the duct. Shaking, hyperventilating, and dizzy with blood loss, Thomas leaned back into the lever with his entire remaining strength, forcing the heavy metal damper the last few feet. The damper slammed shut with a final, echoing boom, sealing the ventilation shaft completely. He staggered backward, grabbing the ruined, empty steel container he had opened earlier, and shoved it against the external lock of the damper control, using its weight to reinforce the seal. He sank to the floor beside the massive container, holding his streaming arm, listening. The creature thrashed, trapped inside the dark, tight confines of the shaft, but the movements became slower, weaker. There was a sound of low, frustrated whines, followed by a final prolonged, shuddering expulsion of air, a breath held for too long, finally released. Then absolute, profound silence. Thomas waited, his body convulsing in shock, his eyes fixed on the immovable container reinforcing the sealed opening. He waited for several agonizing minutes until the certainty settled in, chilling and absolute. The creature had been contained. Its path ended not by a heart failure, but by the relentless, suffocating enclosure of thick steel and concrete. He had survived the night, but he was irreparably changed, soaked in his own blood and the black metallic spray of the thing that had almost destroyed him. The arrival of help was an anticlimax defined by industrial noise and official sterility. Thomas, leaning against the cold wall, his head swimming with shock and pain, watched through the thin glass of the preparation room door as the local police arrived, followed quickly by the fire department. Alerted by the persistent screaming of the refrigeration alarm and Thomas's frantic whispering call to the landline, once he realized the immediate danger had passed. The subsequent hours were a blur of flashing blue lights and the overwhelming scent of ozone, cut through by the sharp, metallic tang of the creature's blood. Firefighters, faces set in bewildered expressions, had to use heavy-duty cutting torches to slice into the reinforced steel container and dismantle the ventilation shaft around the creature's immovable, rigid form. The official story, established quickly and definitively by a grim-faced State Patrol lieutenant who arrived within the hour, was a marvel of bureaucratic denial. The cause was categorized as a severe accident involving a large, aggressive feral animal, a rogue black bear that had been illegally caged for transport and became disoriented. No one asked how a rogue bear managed to tear through millimeter-thick welded steel, or why it was found jammed in an air duct 30 feet beneath a funeral home. The initial paperwork, the fake shipping manifest, and the obscene cash transfer vanished into the bureaucratic ether, filed away as an anonymous error in a system designed to look the other way. The creature was quietly removed in specialized, unmarked containment bags, its remains destined for specialized environmental disposal. Thomas was taken to the closest clinic. He was pale, incoherent, and suffering from acute shock and heavy blood loss from the deep, ragged lacerations on his shoulder and forearm. The nurse cleaned the wounds with aggressive scrubbing, noting the strange, localized bruising around the tears. "Nasty bite," the doctor murmured, though Thomas insisted it was not a bite, but a claw strike. "We will get you stitched up. You will have quite a story to tell." Thomas received 17 deep sutures across the wounds. The pain was dull and distant, mediated by shock and a steady drip of morphine. He did not sleep that night, despite the medication. He lay rigid on the narrow hospital bed, staring at the ceiling tiles, unable to filter the sensory input. The humming of the ancient fluorescent lights seemed deafening. The ticking of the clock over the door was a monstrous hammer blow. He smelled the sickly sweetness of the antiseptic, the faint odor of burned coffee from the waiting room, and the residual scent of fear on his own skin with a painful clarity. Around 3 in the morning he woke suddenly, not from pain but from a profound internal shift. He sat up, throwing the sheet aside. He looked at his shoulder, bandaged heavily. The skin around the edges of the sutures, the raw, torn flesh, should have been inflamed, swollen, throbbing with the white blood cells fighting infection. Instead, the wounds were clean. Too clean. He peeled back the gauze slightly, wincing as the adhesive pulled at his skin. What he saw beneath was not the red, raw edges of a fresh injury. The skin was knitting together at a frightening, accelerated pace. The tissue around the deep lacerations was firm, almost unnaturally dense. And it was tightening, pulling the edges of the wound together with fierce, aggressive efficiency. It was as if his body was rushing to rebuild itself, not with the delicate softness of scar tissue, but with the thick, rubbery density of the creature's own sinew. A horrifying realization dawned. The creature's blood, the thick, potent, formaldehyde-mixed ichor that had sprayed him when the needle was expelled, had found its way into his open wounds. He was not suffering from infection. He was suffering from a violent, rapid biological assimilation. He stood up, testing his balance. The fog of shock had lifted. Replaced by a cold, alert precision, he felt a coiled power in his limbs, a total absence of fatigue. He felt the world in new, agonizing detail. His brain, steeped in the animalistic essence of the creature's blood, mixed with the preserving chemicals, operated on a different primal frequency. The subtle air currents in the room registered against his skin. He heard the low, static hum of the power lines outside the building. Several blocks away, he walked to the bedside table. A plastic bag lay there, sealed shut, containing his clothes. His old, ruined scrub shirt, dark with his own blood, and smeared with the indelible metallic black of the beast's bodily fluids. He brought the fabric to his face, inhaling deeply. The scent of iron and formalin was strong, but beneath it, clear and sharp, was the distinctive, pungent animal musk. The scent of wet dirt, pine, and pure, concentrated predator. The smell was a signature, a map to the terrible anatomy he had struggled with hours earlier. He felt not sickness, but a profound, almost dizzying clarity, as if a curtain had been torn away, revealing the true, hidden nature of the sensory world. He was not well. He was changing. The quiet man of methodical stillness had inherited the hyper-aware instincts of the thing he had helped destroy. Thomas stayed in the clinic for 3 days, insisting to the staff that he simply required rest and observation. He kept his accelerated healing a secret, hiding the fact that the 17 stitches were entirely unnecessary, anchored in solid, dense tissue that had knit together almost seamlessly. He refused pain medication, recognizing that the dulling of his senses was now a greater threat than the lingering ache the doctors attributed his unnerving alertness, his deep-set, wide eyes, and his constant vigilance to post-traumatic stress. Thomas played the part of the traumatized victim, while internally he adjusted to a radical sensory landscape. The world had become too loud, too bright, too saturated with information. Sounds that had once been background noise were now individual, distinct signatures. The friction of a nurse's rubber soles on linoleum, the distant metallic hiss of an air brake 5 blocks away, the minute, rhythmic clicking of the heat expanding and contracting in the copper pipes behind the wall. Smell was the most profound change. He walked through the sterile hospital corridors, and the scents were a cacophony, a map of everyone who had passed through, what they had eaten, the brand of soap used for the last 24 hours, the thin, faint odor of ozone from the electric generator on the roof. When he was released, he drove his tired sedan back to Iris and Sons. The funeral home was quiet, cleaned. The fire department had done a professional job. The floor was scrubbed, the steel table bleached, and the ruined ventilation shaft sealed over with a temporary plywood board painted government gray. But Thomas's new senses told a different story. For others, the lingering metallic smell was merely the aftermath of violence. For him, the scent was an outline. He followed the path the creature had taken. The dark, musky aroma was heaviest by the old steel crate, tracing a path to the torn sink, and then concentrating overwhelmingly at the site of the sealed ventilation duct. He distinguished the layer of residual human sweat and fear from the distinct, concentrated musk of the creature's own vital fluids. He began a systematic examination of his transformation. The scars on his arm were dense, thick, and insensitive to normal pain. When he touched the tissue, he felt a strange electric rush of strength, a feeling of muscles tightening below the surface with an alien rubbery resilience. The first field test was performed on the edge of the sprawling national forest that abutted the town. He walked out into the cold, moonless night. His sight was instantaneous and perfect. The contrast of light and shadow vanished. He did not merely see in the dark. He saw the texture of the dark, distinguishing every pine needle, every damp cluster of moss, every rise and fall of the earth through the thick soles of his boots. He moved silently. His balance was unnaturally refined. He understood then, his ability was not a curse or a gift. It was a sensory overlay, a biological echo caused by the potent blood mixing with the embalming fluids and his own nervous system. The encounter had bypassed logic and given him the world through the sensory apparatus of a large, high-functioning predator. He had become a passive receiver, a human with the instincts of a beast. He returned to the morgue to conduct his true investigation. He needed to find out who had delivered the creature. The official paperwork was a joke, but his senses were better than any paper trail. He located the transport plastic lining that the movers had carelessly left behind, crumpled beneath a workbench. He brought it close to his face. The plastic held faint, complex odors. He detected the metallic scent of the heavy chains, the residual diesel and motor oil from the transport vehicle, and the faint, sweet smell of damp wood pulp. But layered over these were the human scents of the two men who had handled the delivery. He recognized the deep scent of stale salt and exhaustion, the scent of genuine, poorly paid manual labor. But beneath that, distinct and clean, he found the traces of something else. The sharp, herbal scent of expensive imported cologne, and the faint, unmistakable residue of burnt gunpowder and bore cleaner. These were not freight handlers. These were trained operators, soldiers, or hunters. They had brought the creature not to be stored, but to be eliminated and contained, and Thomas had accidentally interfered with the final stage of their operation. They were dangerous, sophisticated, and they had just lost valuable, sensitive cargo. He realized the horror had barely begun. The people who delivered the monster were now coming back to clean up the mess he had made. The following morning, Thomas used the minimal information on the fake manifest to begin his search. The listed address for the third-party administrator was located on the outskirts of the municipal limits, a few miles past the last row of tract homes, situated near the defunct rail yard. He drove slowly, his sedan jarring over the cracked asphalt of a poorly maintained access road. The location was a massive empty warehouse, its corrugated steel walls rusting, the parking lot overgrown with yellowed weeds. It was exactly the kind of shell company setup he had expected, a place for illicit, clandestine operations. He parked half a mile away and proceeded on foot, walking silently across the packed dirt. His new senses were immediately overwhelmed by the residual chaos of the location. The air was heavy with the dried scent of diesel and the thick, oily residue of transport. He followed the olfactory trail, tuning out the noise of the wind and focusing only on the chemical signatures. The musky scent of the creature, though fainter than in the preparation room, was definitely present, mixed into the dust and dry air. He found the staging area behind the warehouse, a slab of cracked oil-stained concrete. There he located a large, dark stain, not blood, but a viscous, oily fluid that smelled subtly of preservative chemicals and motor coolant. It was the same odor he had encountered when he began the embalming process. Adjacent to the stain, he saw the deep rectangular impression left by a massive, heavy crate. The impression was noticeably longer and slightly wider than the one they had delivered to him. This marked the footprint of a second container. Thomas crouched down, running his fingers across the cold concrete. They had not delivered the one they had intended to destroy. Instead, they had brought two. He then shifted his focus, using the hypersensitive vision granted by his transformation. The clay soil surrounding the concrete slab was cold and yielded easily to pressure, He saw the clear, deep imprints of heavy boots. Military issue, but customized. The soles were unusually thin for combat boots, indicating they were designed for stealth and speed. Not standard infantry operations, he counted the imprints. 3 distinct sets of tracks. The hunters. They had been here very recently, within the last 48 hours. Before the rain, they were circling back, checking their staging points after the catastrophic failure of their containment effort at the funeral home. He focused on the individual scents layered on the ground: motor oil, clay, and the persistent human signature. 2 of the hunters smelled like exhaustion and cheap rations. The third one, the one who had handled the initial logistics and transport, carried the strong signature smell of that expensive European cologne and a heavy, lingering cloud of stale tobacco. Thomas inhaled deeply again, tasting the air. The chemical clarity of his new senses provided a cold, certain detail. One set of boot prints was slightly shallower than the others, and the corresponding smell of that person carried a profound undercurrent of dried blood and concentrated adrenaline. One of the hunters was wounded and had been treated here, perhaps by the others. The image solidified in Thomas's mind. A coordinated small-scale military operation gone wrong. A cleanup crew rushing to destroy their evidence before it could compromise their higher-level agenda. He was not merely an unlucky mortician. He was a loose end, a contaminated witness who had also critically allowed their primary target to be contained and then removed by official, albeit confused, channels. He returned home. The cold, practical reality of the situation eclipsed the metaphysical terror of the creature itself. The fear was no longer about a monster in the dark. It was about the men who manufactured or controlled the monster, and who now viewed him as a target. His quiet, orderly life had been replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. He had to understand what these creatures were and why they ended up on his table. He was no detective, but he had the sensory tools of a predator, and he intended to use them to follow the blood trail to its source. The hunters were circling, but Thomas was now capable of circling too. Thomas's transformation deepened over the next few days. The physical changes were subtle but profound. His sleep requirement had dropped almost to 0, replaced by a hypervigilance that felt more like a low-level electrical charge than wakefulness. His metabolism ran at an insane efficiency. He barely ate, yet his stamina was boundless. The skin over his torso and shoulders had grown denser, harder, echoing the unnatural tensile strength of the creature's own musculature. He was becoming a crude, accidental sensory hybrid, his human mind tethered to the flawless instincts of the wild thing. He threw himself into researching the phenomenon. He sat for hours in the basement office, away from the prying eyes of the few remaining staff, trying to connect the dots. The searches were frustrating. Using generic terms like large animal transport, unusual wildlife attacks, or covert containment procedures yielded endless, irrelevant chatter. Whatever the hunters were covering up, the digital footprint was pristine. However, using his new sensory understanding of the creature's physiology, the unusual bone density, the accelerated healing, the resistance to embalming, he shifted his focus to very specific, obscure academic papers. He did not find monsters or werewolves. He found classified documents related to bioengineering and genetic anomalies in large mammals, archived deep within the crevices of the internet. He realized the creature was not an ancient legend, but a controlled, engineered biological entity, perhaps a weapon or a hyper-efficient subject of research that had somehow escaped someone, somewhere, had invested enormous resources in creating this level of biological density and self-repair. Then, buried in a local newspaper archive from a small community 1,000 miles north, near the Canadian border, he found a grainy, weeks-old clipping. Local man missing, presumed wandering. The text mentioned a large-framed man, a known loner and woodsman, who had vanished. Suddenly, the accompanying blurry photograph was useless for facial recognition, but the posture, the sheer bulk, suggested a terrifying possibility. The creature on his table had once existed in a more human guise. The implications were chilling. The thing he had fought was a stage of transformation, not its original state. The connection was tenuous, but the cold logic of the hunter's operation now made terrible sense. This was not just containment. It was a scorched earth campaign to eliminate all evidence of their failed project. Thomas knew he was part of that evidence. He drove back to Iris and Sons that afternoon. The sunlight was strangely painful to his hyper-adjusted eyes. He needed to verify a crucial detail: the creature's initial container. If the hunters were sweeping up, they would not have left the original steel sarcophagus. He entered the preparation room. The space was eerily clean, the sterile metal surfaces reflecting the light like polished mirrors. He walked to the corner where the massive, ruined steel container had been placed, the one he had used to secure the damper shut. It was gone. The only evidence of its presence was a subtle, scraped-out line on the concrete floor. The hunters had returned while he was recovering. They had taken the creature's remains, the ventilation wreckage, and the ruined shipping container. Every physical piece of evidence of the confrontation had been expertly swept away. Thomas's chest tightened. The new, thick muscle suddenly constricted with alarm. They had not just secured the evidence. They had confirmed that the body had been successfully neutralized. They believed Thomas was just a traumatized mortician who would soon forget the details. They had circled back, eliminated the material evidence, and now they were watching him, waiting for him to settle back into his routine. Ready to eliminate the living witness, Thomas stood in the center of the cold, clean room. The silence was oppressive. He had become a phantom in his own life, a man whose reality was defined by the animal senses he had acquired, and the cold certainty that the threat was not external, but intimately tied to the people who had brought the monster to his door. He had foiled their plan once. Now they were hunting him, and they would be far less careless the second time around. Thomas stood still in the precise center of the preparation room, enveloped by the sterile, echoing silence of Iris and Sons. The emptiness was profound. The disappearance of the creature's remains, the ventilation wreckage, and the massive steel crate felt like a final, mocking erasure. His rational world, built on clean procedures and tangible realities, was now utterly reliant on the invisible, animal instincts he had absorbed. He was a man stripped bare, standing amidst the ruins of his former life. All his physical evidence was gone. All that remained was the evidence in his blood, the terrifying knowledge of accelerated healing, the zero need for sleep, and the hyperacute sensory overload that made ordinary life a painful, buzzing cacophony. He knelt down and placed his hand on the cold concrete where the steel crate had rested. He closed his eyes, filtering out the blinding light and tuning in to the olfactory signature of the space. He smelled the pervasive bleach, the clean, slightly metallic scent of freshly scrubbed tile, and the ingrained, decades-old memory of formalin. And beneath that, faint but indelible, was the lingering aroma of the creature, the old, thick, iron-rich scent of its blood, preserved by the chemicals he had tried to inject into it. It was the scent of a battle fought and ended. Thomas remembered the packet of clothes the nurses had given him when he left the hospital, his bloodied scrubs still containing his wallet and personal effects. He walked quickly to the administrative office and retrieved the sealed plastic bag. He pulled out the filthy scrub shirt, the fabric stiff with his own dried blood, and the creature's dense ichor. He held the cloth to his nose, analyzing the signature of the violence. The scent was a complex composite of death, preservation, and lingering panic. It was a history lesson, cold and settled. But as he focused, tuning his new receptors to the deepest, most subtle layers of the aroma, a new note emerged. It was not metallic. It was not preserved. It was profoundly, electrically alive. It was the same dense, wet, animal musk, the signature of pine and concentration, the smell of a large, high-functioning predator. But this iteration was sharp, potent, and unnervingly fresh. It was layered over the cold, dead scent of the fabric, meaning it had not been there when the shirt was packaged at the hospital. It was a scent left recently. Within minutes, Thomas opened his eyes, the realization slamming into him with the physical force of a heavy door. The body he had destroyed had left its odor on the room. The body he had destroyed was gone, and its scent was fading. But the fresh musk, the scent of the living creature, was not fading. It was strong. It was current. The horrifying certainty settled instantly, cold and hard. The creature he had fought, contained, and finally destroyed had been transported here in one massive steel crate. The hunter's tracks at the staging ground had indicated the presence of a second, larger crate. And the living, fresh scent of the monster, the scent of a fully active, breathing specimen, was here now, in the same building. Thomas turned slowly, his enhanced hearing picking up the almost imperceptible sound of an air current changing somewhere in the dark administrative hallway behind him. A sound far too subtle for any human ear to catch. He was no longer the hunter. He had become the prize.